Great Depression. It is a severe worldwide economic depression. The Great Depression started in the U.S. The timing of the Great Depression varied around the world. It started in 1929 and lasted until the late 1930s. It was the longest, deepest, and the most widespread depression of the 20th century. The Great Depression is commonly used as an example of how intensely the global economy can decline. Next is the history of the Great Depression. The Great Depression began in the U.S. 1929 summer. Its output and prices fell precipitously. The industrial production in the United States declined 47%, and the real gross domestic product, which is known as GDP, fell 30%. The depression affected virtually every country of the world. It affected European countries a lot, such as Great Britain, Germany, or France. While some less developed countries experienced severe depressions, others, as Argentina and Brazil, experienced comparatively mild downturns. Japan also experienced a mild depression, which began relatively late and ended relatively early. The U.S. recovery began in the spring of 1933. Output grew rapidly in the mid-1930s. GDP rose at an average rate of 9% per year between 1933 and 1937. In 1937 to 1938, the United States suffered another severe downturn, but after mid-1938, the American economy grew even more rapidly than in the mid-1930s. Recovery in the rest of the world varied greatly. The British economy stopped declining soon after the Great Britain abandoned the gold standard in September 1931. Although genuine recovery did not begin until the end of 1932. The economies of Latin American countries began to shrink in late 1931 and early 1932. Germany and Japan both began to recover in the fall of 1932. Canada and smaller European countries started to revive at about the same time with the U.S., which is 1933. On the other hand, France, which experienced severe depression later than most countries, did not firmly enter the recovery phase until 1938. Third is the causes of the Great Depression. There are several causes of the Great Depression. First is the stock market crash. Stock prices had risen more than 4 times since 1921. In 1928 and 1929, the Federal Reserve have raised interest. The gold standard is not efficient if the economy needs to be stable by fluctuating the rates in hope of slowing the rapid rise in stock crashes. And the second is the banking panics. Banks must liquidate loans in order to raise the required cash. This process of hasty liquidation can cause the bank to fail. The United States experienced widespread banking panics in the fall of 1930, the spring of 1931, the fall of 1931, and the fall of 1932. The final wave of panics continued through the winter of 1933 and ended with the National Bank holiday declared by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on March 6, 1933. The panics took a severe toll on the American banking system. By 1933, 1/5 of the banks had failed.
1/3?
1/5.
1/5.
Yeah. Third is the gold standard. Under the gold standard, each country sets the value of its currency in terms of gold. The gold standard is not efficient if the economy needs to be stabilized by fluctuating the exchange rate. Fourth is the result of the Great Depression. The Great Depression had devastating effects in both rich and poor countries.
Devastating effects.
Personal income, tax revenue, profits and prices dropped, while international trade fell more than 50%. Unemployment in the U.S. rose to 23% and in some countries rose as high as 33%. Constructions were halted in many countries. Farming communities and rural areas suffered as crop prices fell about 60%. Let's talk about the solutions and policies in order to overcome the Great Depression. At the time, America's president was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he implemented the New Deal policies.
Wow.
He carried out the Work Progress Administration, WPA, and Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC. The WPA gave some 8.5 million people jobs.
8.5 million people jobs?
Yeah. Its construction projects produced more than 500,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, and 750 bridges and 1,800 parks. Also under its aegis were the Federal Art Project, Federal Writing Project, and Federal Theater Project. The CCC provided national conservation work primarily for young unmarried women. Projects included planting trees, building flood barriers, fighting forest fires, and maintaining the forest roads and trails. And this policy was implemented for 100 days. The second New Deal was the 3 R's, which represented relief, recovery, and reform. New Deal recovery programs were intended to help stabilize and rebuild the economy. New Deal reform programs involved legislation that was intended to guard against an economic disaster like the Great Depression ever recurring. It targeted banking, the stock markets, labor, and the labor unions. Finally, it's time for Q&A. Number 1, what is the Great Depression? Just briefly.
Great Depression.
It is a severe economic worldwide depression. Number 2, why did the Great Depression happen?
Yes.
First, it became as the bank panic, and the gold price and stuff.
Gold standard.
Oh yeah, gold standard and stock market
Crash. Yeah. And number 3, what are the major 3 policies that Franklin D. Roosevelt implemented? Eric.
WPA and CCC and the 3 R's.
Yeah. And thank you for listening.
Okay.